so he did not want to be on bad terms with the Arab world. And so he demanded that basically Israel end its incursion. A couple of days later, he clarified that he meant that Israel should end it immediately. And a day after that, Condoleezza Rice got on TV quite upset, saying, immediately means now. We expect the Israelis to end the incursion now. And in response, the Israel lobby essentially swung into action. There were 100,000 emails that were sent to the White House from Christian evangelical coalitions. Basically, AIPAC applied pressure on Congress, and the next thing you know, Congress is passing resolutions basically supporting Israel's incursion in defiance of the administration's requests to the opposite. And eventually, Bush essentially caved. He realized this was not worth the fight, and he said that Israel had responded satisfactorily to his call, but Israel had actually done no such thing. So this is one example of the lobby overcoming U.S. administration opposition. Another would be the settlement building that goes on. Virtually every president up until the second George W. Bush opposed settlements quite explicitly. And in the case of George Bush I, the opposition was so intense that he actually threatened to cut off loan guarantees to Israel. And there are heated comments on the record from James Baker and Bush I that basically showed that they were quite upset about this. But in the end, the settlements continued, and the settlements continue until today. So I think the pattern that you see emerging is that when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israel lobby seems to be able to get its way over administration opposition. But when you're talking about broader strategic issues, the lobby does not stand a chance in the face of more powerful players. And what's important to note here is one might say, well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not of strategic interest, so the U.S. doesn't care that much. But the problem here is that this is not entirely true, is that U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been very costly for the United States on many fronts, the obvious ones being national security and the United States' image in the world. And then, of course, in terms of strategic positioning in the Middle East, and for that matter, in more details about access to oil and things like that. So on this particular issue, you can say that the Israel lobby does override independent U.S. policy preferences on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the detriment of the United States. And I know we're running out of time, so we can talk more about that in a bit.
Well, there isn't going to be much of a debate because I basically agree with almost everything you've said, and I've written it many times. I think you're right in taking the narrow definition of the Israeli lobby. Even in the book, Walt Mearsheimer sometimes defined the lobby so loosely that it becomes close to tautologous. But if we keep to organized groups, like, for example, the Christian evangelicals, who, as you say, who you claim, I don't agree, were instrumental in overcoming administration opposition to the Operation Defensive Shield, destruction of Jenin. Yeah, that's a big group. Christian evangelicals are probably a third of the Republican vote, maybe a quarter of the population, huge electoral bloc. But the government does not go along with them. Their position is that the U.S. should support every Israeli action, everything, blow up the Temple Mount, which they've tried to do. And the U.S. government doesn't do that. Their reason for doing it is because they're dedicated anti-Semites. Their position, probably the most extreme. They want, a lot of them are accept a particular interpretation, the rapture interpretation of Revelations, which says what's going to happen is there's going to be a war, Gog and Magog and all that business, and then there'll be a great war in Armageddon. Everybody will be slaughtered, and those who are saved, namely us, will rise to heaven. What happens to the Jews? Well, they're not saved. Okay, so that's anti-Semitism at its most extreme level. And yes, they do want to support Israeli policies because they'll lead the war. But the U.S. government doesn't go along with that. In the case of Operation Defensive Shield, notice that if that's used as an example, then the lobby argument is in a serious self-contradiction. Walton Mearsheimer, as you point out, tried to claim that Israel drove the United States to the Iraq War on the side. That's completely contradicted even by their own evidence. But suppose we accept it as true. The logic that you outlined is that the lobby wanted the lobby harmed U.S. interests by forcing the U.S. to accept the Jenin operations, even though it was undermining support for going to war with Iraq. Well, you can't have both positions. Either the lobby drove us to the war with Iraq, or the lobby harmed the effort to go to the war with Iraq, but not both. So I don't think that example shows much, and in fact, I don't know of any evidence that the U.S. cared one way or another whether Israel smashed up Jenin. Yeah, it caused a lot of problems in what, to adopt the standard racist terminology, what's called the Arab Street. We don't talk about the British street or the French street, but there's a thing called the Arab Street, namely the population. And yeah, the population didn't like it. In fact, Bush is much more unpopular in, say, Saudi Arabia than Ahmadinejad or Jenin or Osama bin Laden. But the question is whether anybody cares about that. I mean, as long as the U.S.-backed tyrannies are able to completely control their own populations, then the U.S. government doesn't care that much about the populations. And they have been able to do that. The most valued and oldest ally of the United States in the region is actually Saudi Arabia. It's where most of the oil is. It's also the most extreme fundamentalist tyranny in the world. And if you look at what harms U.S. policy, we know, not just now, but way back. Back in the 1950s, in 1958, President Eisenhower asked his staff why there's a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world. And the National Security Council, highest planning agency, had just given an answer. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh, brutal, tyrannical regimes and impedes development and democracy, and does so because it wants to control our oil. They went on to say the perception's true, and that's the way we should do it. So yeah, that harms U.S. interests if you think that the so-called Arab Street is something that the U.S. cares about. And so that persists until today. Right after 9/11, the Wall Street Journal did a study of the kind of Arabs they care about, what they called moneyed Muslims, rich guys, directors of multinational corporations, bank managers, that sort of thing, people very much embedded inside the U.S.-dominated system, and asked them, why they were antagonistic to the U.S. They gave basically the same reasons. They did add the sanctions against Iraq as a major reason, and also repression of the Palestinians, but they focused on the same reasons. The U.S. supports harsh and undemocratic regimes, tyrannies, blocks democracy and development, and does so because it wants to control our oil. Okay, it's not the Israeli lobby that's pushing that. That's the way the U.S. has determined its strategic goals, not only in the Middle East, the same everywhere else. Same policies around the world. Nothing special about the Middle East. There are, as far as the, just one factual comment, as far as the scale of the lobby, in the sense that you correctly define it, in political science terms, money, membership, that sort of thing, that's been analyzed in detail by Stephen Zunis, and I advise you to look at it. And it turns out it's one of the smaller lobbies. It's dwarfed. It's totally dwarfed by the business lobbies, which are totally overwhelming, and even by things like the lawyers' lobby or the real estate agents' lobby and so on. It's influential, but it's influential, I think, largely because, as you say, it conforms mostly to U.S. policy. I don't consider the cases that you mentioned very. Let's take the George Bush 1 case, which is an interesting one, which is seriously misunderstood. That's the other example that's standardly given for the power of the lobby. George Bush #1 and his Secretary of State, James Baker, took the most extreme position against the Palestinians and support of Israeli expansion of any president. But they did it in secret, so they weren't getting any lobby support or pressure for it. We now know, because actually the documents were known, but they were kept quiet. They took the position. They supported the coalition, the Israeli coalition government position, the Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Shamir position, that there can be, I'm quoting it now, no additional Palestinian state between the Jordan and the sea, meaning there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan, and there can't be an additional Palestinian state. And the fate of the territories, they said, has to be implemented in accord with the wishes of the government of Israel. That was endorsed in what was called the Baker Plan, the December 1989 Baker Plan, which endorsed exactly that position. That's the harshest position, anti-Palestinian position, that's been taken by any American president. That was George Bush, the first. No lobby pressure. The lobby probably didn't know about it. But yeah, that's the position they took. It's kind of like saying that the Jews don't need Israel because they already have New York, so there has to be an additional Jewish state. It's very much like that. If anybody were to say that, he'd be called a Nazi, you know. But that's the position that George Bush the first and James Baker took. No pressure from the lobby. The conflict was over something else.